Welcome back to Empower Indie Podcast. This podcast creates space for honest conversations about health, well-being, and community resources to help people in southwestern North Dakota live healthy, full lives. The Empower Indie Podcast is produced by Women Empowering Women, a nonprofit organization dedicated to connecting, supporting, and educating women to help them become the best versions of themselves. To become a member or learn more, visit wewnetwork.org. Today, I'm joined by Chelsey and Madison from Connect Medical. Before we get started, can you guys introduce yourselves?
Yeah, I am Chelsey Crone. I'm the Director of Nursing at Connect Medical Clinic.
I am Madison Gellner. I'm the care coordinator for Connect Medical Clinic.
Okay, I want to give a big shout out to Braxton, our producer. She's done awesome. This is her brainchild, and she is amazing. Before I dive in, let's talk about just kind of your host. So I'm Crystal Sullivan, family nurse practitioner here in Dickinson. I am really into volunteering in the community, and my family is a big part of a lot of different committees and organizations. So Women Empowering Women is one of my favorites, and I'm super excited to be the host for this podcast. And then we will just start with the content. Okay, so when we talk about body literacy from a provider and patient perspective, why does using correct body part names matter when it comes to STI prevention?
That's a great question. I think it's really important to name the parts of the body and to know what those are, but also how they work, how we are created, how our bodies were created to work, how they function, to know the ins and the outs, to know what to look for that's normal, but also what's abnormal as well.
Okay.
I also think, right, it kind of takes away that shame aspect. A lot of times in the sexual health, body literacy realm, we can get shameful, and it's just our body. They're just names, and by calling them the right anatomical name, you know exactly what you're talking about. And like I said, it really dispels that shame aspect.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, like as a mom, I don't think there's a necessarily an, a young enough time that you need to start using anatomical correct,
Mm-hmm.
names. But what are your opinions on how early you should start using those names?
I mean, I think as early as you can, as they're building vocabulary, and I mean, they're learning from you as parent, and so as early as you're able to. It's not too early.
Well, and I have a 3-year-old, right? So we're right at that point where it's like, okay, which route do we want to go? And we have started using those anatomical names.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, I was not raised in a household where that was the norm. So
Yeah.
there's actually some getting used to on my part as well. But I think putting everybody on the same playing field with the same vocabulary is super important too.
Well, I think your reaction to using the right names is what really matters too, especially with those younger ages.
Mm-hmm.
Making sure that you're reacting in a mature way, because it is kind of, a shock when they start saying those words and then you're like, "Oh, I taught them this. This is okay. Don't react," because when you react, then it makes it really funny for them and then they start using it inappropriately, which is the opposite effect that you want. So when we're talking to parents, how do we move away from fear-based messaging with STI health and we talked about our little kids, but when they start getting to the older ages, how do we move away from that fear-based messaging and just making sure that we're focusing education on prevention?
Great question. I think that, I mean, we're talking to kids, if we're speaking as parents, or even really providers, right? We want to build relationship, and so we want them to be comfortable with the conversation that we're having. So we want to continue conversations as they grow, so that when they are in the teen years, this is not the first time they've heard of these conversations, these topics. We're going to tailor that, age specific, but I think that, parents specifically, that it's the conversation that's happening in the home with their children. And then also that they, have a provider to go to, trusted, person to go to, whether that is someone in the school, um, provider, or parent. But those conversations really starting at home.
I think it's a great time for reflection, right? Like, what was your own personal experience around puberty, around sexual health? Like, was it positive? Was it negative? If it was positive, like, take little bits and pieces and use that. If it was negative, how do we do better,
Right.
right?
I think that something that a lot of parents, because they're fearful of having those conversations, they rely on the schools or the provider to talk to their kids. And a lot of kids, the first time they have these conversations is in a classroom full of other kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead of having like some insight and understanding what the presenter's talking about, they're now being kind of blindsided with that information because they didn't have that at home. So I think, you know, explaining to parents and even as a provider, making sure that you're having those conversations with kids before they hit that age in the exam room with the parents so that everyone's on the same page and they go home and have that conversation, you kind of open up the topic.
Mm-hmm.
That goes a long ways for preparing kids before they have the classroom talks.
Not just opening the topic, but I think really setting a precedent of home is a safe space for these questions, right? Kids are resourceful, right? They're going to figure it out. So if they do have questions, would you rather them come home to a trusted adult and have that conversation? Or we can go to internet, peers, all of that kind of stuff. And there's tons of information. It's not like
Right.
they're not going to find an answer, but is it necessarily the way that you wanted that topic to be talked about?
Right. And it can definitely skew their perception and can also kind of make if they have to go find answers themselves, it's going to make the conversation with the parent a lot harder
Mm-hmm.
because they already have a perception of what they think prior to having that conversation.
Yeah.
That kind of leads into our next topic of family values, faith, and reducing shame. So many parents want STI conversations to align with their family values or faith. How can parents do that without avoiding conversations about protection and testing?
So I think when, Maddie spoke to the shame piece of it, it's having these conversations with their kids. It's being able to share from the home what values, what, faith plays a role in their family, but then also speaking to, um, truth with their child, giving them the real information and hearing it in the home first. But the more that these things are talked about, I think that those walls of shame are just really reduced for their child, and they can feel that it's a safe place to come to talk to mom, talk to dad when something's going on, or guardian, whoever is in there, they're in their corner for support. But starting those conversations, reducing that shame, and so that they'll come and they'll ask questions, and they will, hopefully be able to feel comfortable and moving forward with that trusted person.
I also think we're at a super interesting point in history and the family, right? Those topics that were maybe taboo 10, 20 years ago are more coming to the light, and there is an opportunity to have a different conversation. So instead of just kind of leaving those things in the corner and nobody talks about it, let's bring it to the light and just have a really honest conversation, and having a family member or somebody they trust being the first person to have that conversation, I think is really important in setting a precedent.
But I think just having them know the information of how to prevent STIs in the first place is a huge step in relieving some of the worries that parents have regarding the conversation. So it's almost like a vicious cycle, because if you don't have the conversation, then they aren't prepared and they can't protect themselves. And then if you have the conversation, they can, but that means that, you know, you also have to help them find out how to protect themselves. So I think that's a scary thing for some parents, especially when faith is intertwined in that too. So providers can definitely be a link between those things to be able to help the parent guide through it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think too that, some parents might feel afraid that having these conversations means that these things are going to happen. If I speak with my child about sex, that they're going to have sex. And so, really, just being able to provide that education and support to their child is so important. And it coming, like Maddie said, first from the home. And, the kids are thinking that everyone else is doing it when studies are showing that's not actually what's happening, but that education coming to them from the home first and knowing where their values come from, looking at things from a risk avoidance and a risk reduction standpoint and what their options are with all of that, having all the information to really just make the best decision.
Knowledge is power in the end,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you don't know, you can't help yourself.
Right. And I think that kids knowing that their parents, at least for, in my situation, I have 3 teenage boys. So I think us having conversations early has really opened up the dialogue to where, you know, anytime they have questions about anything or even concerns or topics that, they've heard from their friends, they don't feel uncomfortable talking to us, which to me is a parenting win.
That's awesome.
That's
You know,
great.
that's
Yeah.
a that's a huge win. And I think it started with having those anatomical conversations of like, this is your body parts, this is what, at a very young age, talking about condoms, talking about STIs, talking about anatomy, like all of those things come with that. And I think as providers, we really can help guide parents to get to that point and give them resources too. So our next topic is boundaries, consent, and healthy relationships. So how do conversations about boundaries and consent directly support STI prevention?
Yeah, well, that has to be a part of the conversation, right? We need to be talking about boundaries. We need to be talking about consent, but not just consent, informed consent. So again, having all of the information to be able to make a decision is so important. And when we go into schools and we teach sexual risk avoidance, boundaries and consent are all part of the conversation that we're having with students, and it's really just a full wraparound message. It's important to have.
And I think it's really important to acknowledge, right? Sexual activity doesn't just stop there. It encompasses the whole person, right? We're talking mentally, obviously, physically, but every aspect you need to be aware that that is going to affect you and possibly change you in some way. So, like Chelsey said, right? Just having all the information to make an informed decision.
And I think that it is something that, as a mom of all boys, was something I guess I didn't put as much value of realizing that I needed to make sure that my boys felt like they had the power to make sure that they were giving consent and that that they were initiating those conversations. In my mind, as a female, I guess I assumed that it was the females that do that, and that was something that I, as a parent, had to realize, like, oh, males need to do this as well. And this is something I need to teach my kids about. And that's something, as a parent, I wasn't really prepared for, that like epiphany that it's not just always the girl that needs to have that conversation first. How can parents connect healthy relationships with lower STI risk?
So I think when we look at reducing risk, right, we're looking at numbers of partners, that kind of thing. Just making sure that you have all the information, that there's no coercion, there's consent, there's good, healthy boundaries there. I think all of those things really play in from a healthy relationship to lower STI rates.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Maddie said. Really just modeling, what that healthy relationship looks like, having the conversations with them about what's healthy, what's not, so they feel comfortable to come to you and, share the things that are on their heart that they might be walking through. They're going through heavy things and big changes as they're growing, and, just really wanting to be open to all it is that they might be able to bring.
So that leads into our next topic, creating safe spaces for STI conversations. So how do we as parents create those safe spaces? And we've already kind of hit on some of those things, but what are some realistic ways parents can start conversations specifically about STI prevention and testing?
Yeah, so I think just making the space for your children. It's really easy in our days to be rushed with all the tasks and things we have, but being really intentional to spend time, to open up time for them, to ask them questions about what's going on in their lives and their friendships and their relationships, um, and just continuing to build a trust with them. Um, and really just taking the shame piece out of it. No judgment zone, or really no reaction to whatever it is that they're going to share. Just coming from a supportive place, a loving place, help connect with them and help know that you're in their corner.
And I mean, parents, I want to give you huge props because this is not an easy area, right? Nobody looks forward to this or forward to these conversations, but they're so, so important. So like Chelsey said, right, leaving the shame and the judgment at the door, really giving them a space that is a spot that they can just be honest, I think is huge, but otherwise she hit everything.
Yeah, I think you guys have done a great job, and I think that as parents, you learn and you grow as you're doing it too. And sometimes you might not say the right thing, and sometimes you will. But having those conversations early on gives you the time and the space to guide into it to where you're not suddenly or unexpectedly having to have these conversations.
Right.
So I think that probably is the biggest takeaway as a parent that I had was I was thankful that those conversations started early. And I think it was more related to being a provider that they started early because I was like, oh, my kids need to know this. Well, luckily it set us up for success, but not all parents have that experience of being able to know that's something you have to start talking about early. So I think as providers, we can really guide them into that at well child visits, being able to talk about the anatomy of body parts, making sure that we're talking to patients about, my body, making sure they know that it's only them that touches their body, and just really talking about those topics in the clinic too, because the school does a great job of having that, but it's at one, it's in one age group, and it doesn't get followed up on a lot afterwards. And so I think it really does rely on healthcare providers to help with that.
I agree. It's definitely just that continual conversation and that support network, right? The parents,
Right.
the providers, the school as they're able. We, go into the schools and are able to teach the youth in the community, which is something we're all really passionate about. But really just speaking to the parents, it's okay if you don't always say the right things. I know
Right.
as moms, I've definitely had my share of times where I haven't always said the right thing. But there's grace in that. And I think that, asking for forgiveness from your child in those situations, and like you're learning together as they're growing, and then you're showing them that side of things too. So
And there can kind of be that gap, right, between what do I know as an adult, what was I taught, versus what are my kids being exposed to, what are they being taught.
Right.
So I think parents can also help themselves out by educating themselves.
Yeah.
If there's something they don't know, there's great resources, right? Try and get on the same page as your kiddo, so that that conversation is easier. If they have questions, right, you hopefully have an answer. And if you don't, you tell them, I don't have the answer right now, but I will certainly find that for you.
Yeah, and I think that knowing your resources as a parent is really helpful too, and relying on, it takes a village, so making sure you're using those resources to be able to guide your kid through those, changes that they're going through. Great information, guys. Looking for STI testing, there are safe and accessible options. You can visit Connect Medical Clinic, talk with your primary care provider. Southwest Health District also has resources. You can come see me at Aspire Health Clinic. You can go to CHI, Sanford. All of those places have options for testing. And then there's also access for free at-home testing through the North Dakota Department of Health and Human Services. This episode was made possible through an STI Prevention and Control grant from the North Dakota Department of Health and Human Services. Until next time, stay informed, stay empowered, and we'll see you on the next Empower Indie podcast.